question came from somewhere deep inside Lydia Carter's mind, raw and trembling, though she never spoke it aloud. How does a mother keep breathing when the world decides her children are no longer hers? The thought hit her like a blow as she stood on the wooden auction block in Lawrence, Kansas territory, her wrists cold with fear and her 3 children pressed close to her skirt. Ben held Rosie's hand so tightly her fingers reddened, and little Caleb whimpered against her waist, sensing something terrible in the charged, dust-scented air. Around them, townsfolk gathered with the casual curiosity reserved for livestock or old furniture, faces half hidden under brims of sweat-dark hats. But none of those faces mattered as much as the 3 small ones looking up at her, waiting for her to fix what she could not fix. Mr. Halpern cleared his throat sharply, tapping the gavel against the post as if impatient with sorrow. "Indenture of one Lydia Carter," he announced, his voice practiced, almost bored. "Widow, age 27, capable laborer, starting at $50. The words fell clean and hard, cutting through the crowd. Above them, clouds rolled low and gray, the kind that looked close enough to touch but brought no comfort, only weight. Lydia felt her breath begin to slip, her body tightening around the terror blooming in her chest. Her children, her life, stood beside her like lambs about to be claimed by strangers. When the first bid rose, Lydia swallowed back a cry. She tried to keep her voice steady, tried not to let the desperation crack her throat. "Please," she whispered, though no one had asked her anything. "Please don't separate us. Please." Ben tugged her sleeve. "Mama," he murmured, his dark eyes huge and reflective. "Where will they take us?" He looked toward Sheriff Nolan Briggs, who stood stiff at the edge of the platform, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. Ben's question drifted up into the heat. But the sheriff did not answer. More bids. $70. $95. $110. Rosie began crying softly, a thin, trembling sound Lydia could feel like needles in her chest. Lydia bent quickly, putting her hand on the girl's cheek. "I'm here," she whispered, though she knew she could not promise she would stay. Caleb clung to her leg, his sobs muffled in her skirts. She wanted to gather all 3 children in her arms, shield them from the world, from the laws that treated her family as numbers in a ledger. But she couldn't move. She had to stand there and listen to strangers decide their fate. Then Mr. Halpern called out, "Sale of minors will proceed separately after the mother's indenture is concluded." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone shifted eagerly. Another man adjusted his hat with interest. "Separate." The word echoed like a hammer. Lydia felt her vision constrict as panic surged. She dared to reach for the sheriff. "Please," she said hoarsely, shaking her head. "Don't take my babies away. Sheriff Briggs, you know us. Please." The sheriff looked away. The bidding climbed past $150. Lydia's knees nearly buckled. Ben stepped in front of Rosie, squaring his small shoulders, guarding her as best he could. Then, with a courage far heavier than his 7 years, he called out toward the sheriff. "What'll happen to us? What happens when they take Mama?" His voice cracked, boyish yet fierce. For a moment, everything stilled. But no answer came. Mr. Halpern lifted the gavel. Going once, and that was when a voice cut through the swarm of heat and dread. $500, a man said. Calm, firm, carrying enough weight to send a ripple through the entire gathering. Every head swung toward the back of the crowd, where a tall, dust-worn cowboy stepped forward. A leather coat draped over one shoulder, his boots leaving quiet impressions in the ground. Harrison Har Brooks walked with the kind of controlled presence that made space for him without him asking. His eyes, steady, deep, unreadable, locked on Lydia and her children. Mr. Halpern blinked, thrown off his rhythm. "Sir, the bid is for the woman alone. Children will be sold separately. Then change the rules." Har's tone didn't rise, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. 500 for all four. Mother and children stay together. The crowd erupted in confusion, surprise, irritation, suspicion. 500 was far beyond logic. It was enough to rebuild a barn, fence a field, buy a team of horses. But Har Brooks didn't blink. "You can take it," he said, "or you can explain to these creditors why you turned down full payment." Sheriff Briggs stepped forward, jaw flexing. "Brooks, this isn't standard procedure." Har met his gaze without flinching. "Neither is selling children like sacks of grain." A few people murmured their agreement. Others scowled. No one dared bid again. Lydia's breath staggered as the sheriff finally exhaled and nodded once. "Record the sale," he said quietly. The gavel struck. Sold. The world seemed to tilt. Lydia dropped to her knees, pulling her children into her arms, their small bodies shaking against her. Relief came so sharply it bordered on pain. Hot, dizzying, overwhelming. She looked up at Har, unable to speak, unable even to form a thought beyond, "We're still together." For the first time in many dark months, something like air returned to her lungs. And as Har Brooks stepped closer, offering his hand with calm steadiness, Lydia realized this man had not simply saved her from an auction. He had changed the entire direction of her life, though neither of them yet understood how deeply that choice would echo. The wagon's wheels rumbled along the rutted road heading north, carrying Lydia Carter and her 3 children away from the square where their lives had nearly been torn apart. The air felt different outside Lawrence, wider, emptier, almost too large to breathe. But Lydia clung to the children beside her, afraid that if she loosened her grip even a little, someone might step out from the tall prairie grass and take them back. Ben sat closest to the edge, knees drawn up, eyes narrowed with the cautious vigilance of someone who had learned early that the world could turn cruel without warning. Rosie leaned against Lydia's shoulder, quiet now but jumpy at every unexpected sound, while Caleb had finally fallen asleep in Lydia's lap, exhausted from fear and too young to understand anything except the tremors in his mother's body. Lydia kept her arm around them all, anchoring them as much as herself. Harrison Brooks sat at the front, reins in hand, his posture steady as the team pulled them along. He didn't speak much, not out of coldness, but out of a kind of careful respect, as if he understood how fragile this moment was. Every now and then, he glanced back to check on them. Not prying, not assessing, simply making sure they were still all right. Lydia watched him once, quickly, then looked away just as fast. She didn't know what to make of him. Kindness that large felt dangerous, almost unbelievable. She had learned to suspect anything that came too easily. Yet he had handed over $500 to keep her family together. He had done so with a calm certainty she still struggled to comprehend. As the miles passed, the landscape shifted. The flat stretches gave way to rolling hills and cottonwoods, marking distant streams. The late afternoon light softened the edges of the world, making everything appear almost gentle. Lydia knew better than to trust that impression, but for the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Rosie lifted her head and whispered, "Mama, are we safe now?" Lydia didn't answer right away. She brushed hair from Rosie's cheek and finally said, "We're together. That's what matters." It wasn't a promise, but it was honest. When the ranch finally appeared on the horizon, broad fields fenced in weathered wood, a barn leaning slightly, and a clapboard house that looked tired but still standing, Lydia felt something loosen inside her. Har slowed the horses and guided the wagon toward the open yard. A man stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He had strong shoulders, gray hair at the temples, and eyes set deep with a lifetime of reading weather and trouble. Har waved him over. "Roy, this is Lydia Carter and her young ones. They'll be staying." Roy Mathers looked them over without judgment, nodding a simple welcome. Lydia appreciated that the most. No pity, no suspicion, just acknowledgement. Har helped them down, motioning toward a small cabin beside the garden plot. "It's cleaned out," he said. "Needs a few repairs, but it's yours. No fees. You'll earn wages. $2 a week, room and board included. What work you do is up to you and what you feel able to handle." Lydia stood there, unsure whether she'd misheard. She knew how indenture contracts worked. She knew what being bought at auction meant. Labor without choice, no pay, no rights. But Har spoke as if he weren't her owner, only a man offering structure to a life already shattered. Ben stepped slightly in front of Rosie and Caleb, still guarding them even here. Har crouched to his level, keeping his voice low. "You won't be doing ranch work meant for grown men. Roy'll give you small tasks when you're ready. Nothing more." Ben didn't nod, but something in his tense shoulders eased. Inside the cabin, Lydia found a simple bed, a table with uneven legs, a chair that wobbled when touched, and a stove that looked older than she was. Yet everything was swept clean. A folded blanket sat neatly on the mattress. Someone had tried, truly tried, to make it a home. She set Caleb down, watching him toddle toward the bed, curious and unafraid now that walls surrounded them. Rosie traced her fingers along the windowsill as if testing whether it belonged to her. Lydia stood in the middle of the space, overwhelmed by the realization that no one here intended to take her children away. Not now. Not tonight. Work began before morning fully rose. Lydia moved through the main house, dusting, sweeping, scrubbing, each stroke of the rag a small reclaiming of dignity. She didn't rush, she didn't waste movement. She simply worked, and the rhythm of it steadied her mind. Roy passed now and then, offering quiet comments about where things belonged. Eddie Lawson, one of the younger ranch hands, dropped off a sack of flour and potatoes with a shy, respectful nod. Ben left with Roy later that morning, though he hesitated, glancing at Lydia as if waiting for permission. She nodded gently. "Go on, sweetheart. You'll be all right." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but she watched until he disappeared around the barn, trusting that Roy would keep him safe. By midday, Har checked in on the house, pausing in the doorway as Lydia reorganized a shelf. "You don't need to do all this in one day," he said lightly. "No sense wearing yourself out." Lydia kept her hands on the shelf, turning slightly. "Work helps," she replied. Har nodded as though he understood more than she was willing to say. As evening settled, Lydia cooked a stew from the supplies Eddie brought. The children ate quietly, content in the warmth of the cabin. When they finally fell asleep, their breathing soft and even, Lydia stepped outside, the cool night brushing against her skin. She looked across the ranch, at the faint glow from the barn, at the silhouette of Har closing a gate, at the stillness settling over the land. She didn't trust this life yet. She didn't trust its stability or its promise. But she could admit one thing. For the first time in a long while, hope no longer felt like a foolish indulgence. It felt like something she might, cautiously, be allowed to hold. The wind arrived before the storm itself, curling across the prairie in long, low moans that rattled the loose boards of the cabin and lifted the dirt in uneasy spirals. Lydia Carter felt the first shift in the air while she was tending to the evening fire. A subtle drop in temperature that made the hair on her arms rise. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked toward the western horizon. Dark clouds stacked on top of one another, fast moving, thickening by the minute. A sense of recognition settled heavily in her chest. The kind born from years of surviving whatever the world decided to throw at her. Storms were trouble. Storms took things without asking, just like men with power and laws without mercy. Harrison Brooks strode from the barn with Roy Mathers close behind, both men scanning the horizon. "It's coming fast," Har said, his voice clipped with urgency. "We need the horses secured, everything tied down." He spotted Lydia standing in the yard, her apron fluttering sharply in the rising wind. "Get the children inside the main house," he called. "Not the cabin? The walls aren't thick enough." Lydia nodded and ran for the cabin, where Rosie and Caleb were stacking wooden blocks while Ben studied a small book Roy had given him. As soon as she opened the door, the change in her expression told them everything. "Storm," she said quickly. "We're going to the big house, now." Ben stood first. "Is Mr. Brooks in danger?" he asked, worry tightening his voice despite the attempt to sound brave. Lydia's breath caught at the question, not because of what he said, but because she recognized in him the same instinct she carried. Fear mixed with hope, tied stubbornly to someone who didn't quite feel like a stranger anymore. "We go where it's safe," she said. "That's how we help him." They hurried through the rising wind, the sky darkening with unnatural speed, the scent of electricity sharp in the air. Har held the door to the main house open as they rushed inside. The moment Lydia stepped past him, the first crack of thunder split the sky. Inside, the walls thudded under the force of wind pushing against them. Rain smacked the windows with violent intensity, each drop a small impact in a building battle. Rosie covered her ears, whimpering, and Lydia pulled her close. Caleb climbed into her lap instinctively, and she wrapped both arms around him. Ben paced near the window, alert and restless, watching flashes of lightning illuminate the yard. "Where is he now?" Ben asked. Lydia followed his gaze. Through the storm-thick shadows, she could make out Har and Roy moving along the corral, tying down equipment, ushering horses into shelter. Even through the sheets of rain, Har's movements were steady, almost defiant. The wind howled. Something heavy crashed outside, wood splitting under force. Rosie gasped and clutched Lydia's arm, trembling. Lydia pulled her closer, whispering reassurance she barely believed. Minutes stretched into long, tense increments of fear. The storm's violence grew, the house groaning as if bracing against a great weight. Another crash echoed. A loose gate slamming free. Ben's breath hitched. Lydia stood, moved to him, and placed her hands on his shoulders. He knows what he's doing. He's weathered storms before, but just as she said it, a shadow staggered into view. Har, limping toward the house. Roy half supported him. Lightning struck behind them, outlining their figures in white. Ben shouted, "He's hurt!" Lydia sprang toward the door before she could think, pulling it open just as Roy hauled Har inside. The wind nearly ripped the door from her grasp. Rain poured off Har's coat, and blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. "He took a beam to the head," Roy said breathlessly. "Stubborn fool wouldn't come inside until every damn horse was settled." Har tried to wave off the concern. "I'm fine," he muttered. But the wobble in his stance said otherwise. He braced a hand on the table, breath uneven. Lydia approached him carefully, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "Sit," she said, her voice firm in a way that surprised even her. Har sat. She fetched a cloth, warm water, and whatever clean towels she could find. Her hands trembled once before she steadied them. As she cleaned the wound, Har stayed still, breathing slowly, eyes occasionally flicking up to hers. Each time their gaze connected, something unspoken moved between them. a shared recognition of vulnerability, of gratitude, of a bond growing in ways neither had invited but both could feel. "You shouldn't have stayed out there so long," Lydia whispered, her fingers gentle but sure. "You could have been killed." Har let out a soft breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "I couldn't leave things unsecured. And the horses panic in storms like this. You still could have died." His gaze softened. "Then I'm glad I made it back. For them," he said, nodding toward the children. A beat passed. "And for you." The words felt heavier than the room, heavier than the storm pressing against the walls. Lydia's breath stilled. She didn't look away, though instinct told her to. Rosie finally unclenched her hands from her ears and whispered, "Mama, is he going to be all right?" Lydia found her voice. "Yes, sweetheart, he will." Thunder rolled across the sky, but inside the house, the energy shifted. The storm raged on, but within these walls, something steadier took root. Trust, fragile yet unmistakably growing. Har reached for Lydia's wrist lightly when she finished bandaging him. "Thank you," he said, low enough that only she heard. She nodded, unable to shape the words waiting in her throat. Hours passed before the wind weakened, before the rain eased into silence. The storm had taken fences, shingles, half the north wall of the barn. Yet all Lydia could think about was the moment Har had looked at her, as if she mattered. Not as property, not as obligation, but as something he needed to return to. She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But she felt its truth like the echo of thunder, softening into the night. Morning light broke unevenly across Brooks Ranch the day after the storm, revealing damage scattered like a map of everything the wind had stolen. Fences lay flattened, roof shingles littered the yard, and branches, some thick as a man's arm, hung at strange angles from the cottonwoods. The ranch hands were already moving, voices low but determined, each man falling into the rhythm of repairs. Lydia Carter stepped outside the main house, still shaken from the long night, though her children clung close with a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before. Ben carried a hammer Roy had given him, walking with a sense of purpose, while Rosie held a small basket of nails as if it were a treasure. Caleb toddled along between them, wanting to be part of whatever came next. She saw Har near the barn, the bandage still on his forehead, giving instructions with his usual calm. But as Lydia watched him, she felt an ache in her chest she wasn't sure how to name. Gratitude, yes. Worry? Something fierce and growing. Something tied to the memory of his eyes when she had cleaned the blood from his face. Something that scared her more than any storm. Har noticed them and walked over, his steps a little slower than normal, but steady. "You all right today?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," Lydia said. "The children slept well." "And you?" Lydia hesitated. "I'm fine." It wasn't entirely true, but admitting anything else felt too vulnerable. Har seemed to understand anyway. He nodded once, the silent kind of reassurance that asked nothing and offered everything. Over the next week, life settled into a rhythm shaped by work and quiet glances, by shared moments too subtle to name. Lydia cooked meals for the men as they repaired the barn, and Har often lingered near the doorway, not interfering, just watching the children play in the yard. Ben began to shadow him, drawn to the way Har moved through the ranch with calm certainty. Rosie asked endless questions, which Har answered with a patience Lydia had never seen in a man before. And Caleb, laughing more freely each day, tugged at Har's pant leg as if the cowboy had always been part of their world. But safety, Lydia knew, always had a price. And it didn't take long for the outside world to remind her. The town's harvest dance approached, a yearly gathering meant to bring the community together. Roy insisted the ranch attend. They needed supplies, new contracts, and visibility after the storm damage. Har agreed, though Lydia sensed his reluctance. She suspected he knew exactly what awaited her in a room full of people who'd seen her sold at auction just weeks earlier. Still, Lydia washed her best dress, braided Rosie's hair, and held her head high as they entered the dance hall. Music played, lively and warm, and for a moment she thought maybe people would simply let them be. But whispers traveled faster than music. Eyes lingered too long. A tight knot formed in her stomach. Near the refreshment tables, Martha Kincaid, Walt's mother, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, stopped Lydia with a smile that never reached her eyes. My, she said, her voice dripping judgment. Seems Mr. Brooks has taken quite a personal interest in you. Some folks say it's improper, a man buying a woman's indenture, then keeping her under his roof. Lydia stiffened. I work for my wages. He treats me respectfully. Martha leaned closer. Respectfully? Is that what we're calling it now? The word sliced cleanly, cold enough to steal Lydia's breath. A couple nearby pretended not to hear, but listened intently. Rosie pressed close to her leg, sensing the tension. Lydia swallowed, forcing calm into her voice. You don't know anything about our situation. Oh, I know enough, Martha said, tilting her head. A woman in your position should value humility. People talk, children hear things. It's not right to confuse them about who their father is. Lydia's cheeks burned. Before she could speak, a deep voice cut through the tight air behind her. That's enough, Martha. Har stepped forward, shoulders squared, expression carved from stone. If you have concerns about my household, you bring them to me. Not to the woman I employ, and not in front of children. Martha drew back, startled by the force of his tone. I meant no disrespect. Yes, Har said, you did. A hush fell around them. The music faltered for a moment before resuming. Har turned to Lydia, his voice gentler. You don't owe anyone here an explanation, but the wound was already there. Thin, invisible, stinging. Lydia managed a nod, though her throat felt tight. Har walked with her to a quieter corner, the children following close. I'm sorry, he said softly. I should have stayed closer. You can't protect us from what people think, Lydia replied. I knew this would happen eventually. Har's eyes darkened. You shouldn't have to face it alone. She looked at him. Really looked. And saw not just the man who saved her at the auction, not the man who survived the storm, but someone wrestling with feelings he did not yet know how to express. Feelings she felt too, though admitting them would mean opening the part of herself she'd locked away since the day her husband died. I'm not sure what we are, Lydia whispered, or what we're allowed to be. Har stepped closer, but not enough to frighten her. I don't care what they say. I know what I feel. Her breath shook. He held her gaze as if the rest of the world had fallen away. And I know you feel it too. Maybe you're not ready. I can give you time, but I won't pretend I don't care about you. The truth of it was a warm weight in her chest, frightening only because it felt so real. She lowered her eyes. I don't know if I can do this. Har's voice softened. Then let me prove you don't have to do it alone. Before she could reply, a new song began. A slow waltz that floated through the hall like a gentle promise. Har hesitated, then extended his hand. Lydia looked at it, torn between fear and the pull she couldn't deny. Finally, she placed her hand in his. He drew her into the dance floor, moving with steady assurance. The room blurred, the whispers fading into nothing. For the length of one song, Lydia let herself exist in the space between fear and hope, guided by a man who held her not as something fragile, but as someone worth steadying. By the end of the night, the judgment still lingered. The doubt still whispered. But so did something stronger, something that told her love might still survive the world trying to crush it. The days following the harvest dance settled into a quieter rhythm, though Lydia Carter felt the aftershocks of that night, long after the music faded. She replayed the moment Har stepped between her and Martha Kincaid. The steady fierceness in his voice, the unshakable certainty in his stance. No man had ever defended her that way. Not even her late husband, who had been kind but worn down by survival. What Har had done wasn't duty. It wasn't obligation. It was choice. And choices like that carried a weight Lydia was almost afraid to look at directly. The air on the ranch turned crisp as autumn deepened, painting the prairie in shades of russet and gold. The world felt quieter, softer somehow, though beneath everyday's chores, tending the garden, mending clothes, cooking meals, Lydia sensed something shifting. Har lingered more often near the cabin when she worked outside, his presence steady but never intrusive. Ben followed him almost everywhere now, learning to tie knots, saddle horses, fix broken boards. Rosie sang while she gathered eggs, and Caleb toddled after anyone who would scoop him up. The ranch, once foreign and intimidating, had begun to feel like a place where their voices belonged. But certainty had never been Lydia's companion for long. One crisp morning, she found Har waiting near the corral fence, hands gripping the rail, expression strangely tense. The horses grazed quietly behind him, their breaths clouding in the cool air. Lydia paused, adjusting Caleb on her hip. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He turned toward her slowly, as though gathering courage. "Can we talk?" Her heartbeat stuttered. She set Caleb down, letting him toddle through the grass. "Of course," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Har exhaled deeply, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping into something irreversible. "Lydia," he began, "I've been trying to give you space, to give you time. But every day I see you here, the children laughing, Ben asking me questions, Rosie holding my hand, Caleb falling asleep on my shoulder." His voice trailed off. Thick with meaning, he struggled to shape into words. "I realize something. I don't want to imagine this ranch without you in it." Lydia felt the world steady beneath her feet, even as her pulse quickened. She didn't speak. She couldn't, not yet. Har stepped closer, careful, measured. "I know what people say. I know how it looks. But I need you to hear me clearly." The wind stilled. "I love you," he said. "I love your children. I want to build something real with you. Not because I saved you, not because you needed help, but because you are strong and kind and the bravest woman I've ever known. And because this ranch doesn't feel like home unless you're standing in it." Lydia's breath caught, her eyes stinging. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Har, you don't know what you're asking. I'm a widow. I was sold at auction. People will talk even more than they already have." "They can talk," Har said firmly. "Let them wear out their voices. I won't let their judgment decide our lives." Her heart trembled, torn between longing and fear. "And the children," she whispered. "I want to be part of their lives," Har said. "Not to replace their father, not to take anything from them. Just to give them what I can. Safety, guidance, a home. If they'll have me." Ben stood in the shadow of the barn, listening. Lydia hadn't noticed him approach. When he stepped closer, eyes shining with uncertainty, Har fell silent. Ben swallowed hard. If you marry Mama," he said quietly, "will things change?" Har knelt so he could meet the boy eye to eye. "Yes," he said honestly, "but only in ways that add to what you already have. Your father will always be your father, Ben. I'm not here to erase him. I just want to help take care of you. To teach you what I know. To be someone you can count on." Ben's throat bobbed. "You won't send us away? Ever?" "Never," Har answered. "Not as long as I'm breathing." The boy nodded slowly, then stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Har's shoulders. It was small, hesitant, but full of trust. Har froze for a moment, moved beyond words, then returned the embrace gently. Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something that felt like surrendering to hope. When they stood, Har turned back to Lydia. "I'm asking you," he said softly, "to marry me. Not out of rescue, out of love. Out of wanting a life with you that's honest and earned." Lydia closed her eyes. She saw the auction block. She saw the storm. She saw the cabin lit by warm firelight. She saw Har holding Caleb, guiding Ben, brushing Rosie's hair from her eyes with fatherly care. She saw a life she had never dared imagine. When her eyes opened, they were wet but certain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Har. I'll marry you." The wedding was small, simple, just the ranch hands, the sheriff, and Mrs. Emmeline Pratt, who had always been kind. They gathered beneath the cottonwoods, branches swaying gently overhead. Rosie carried wildflowers she picked herself, and Ben stood proudly at Har's side. Caleb toddled through the grass, giggling, unaware that his world was changing in the best possible way. Har spoke his vows with steady conviction. "I promise to protect this family, to honor what you've lived through, and to give you a home where no one can take you away again." Lydia answered with a quiet strength that silenced the breeze. "I promise to build a life with you, not out of fear or need, but out of hope and trust and the love we've found." After the ceremony, Har led Lydia to the barn and revealed a wooden sleigh he had built by hand, a gift crafted from long nights and quiet intentions. "For our winters," he said. "For all the seasons ahead." Lydia traced the smooth lines of the wood, her breath unsteady. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," Har answered. That night, as the newly formed family stepped into their home, Lydia felt something settle inside her, a peace she had never known. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but real, hard-won, the kind built not from rescue alone, but from choosing each other again and again, even when the world pushed back. A chosen family, a reclaimed future, a life no longer defined by survival, but by belonging. The house glowed softly in the quiet of evening, its windows catching the last golden trace of daylight as Lydia stepped inside. The warmth brushing over her skin like a promise whispered low. Beyond the doorway, she heard the children's laughter, light, free, unburdened in a way she once feared they would never know again, and Har's deep voice guiding them towards sleep. She paused there for a long moment, letting the stillness settle, letting her breath fall slow and even, letting herself believe she had finally reached a place where the world no longer waited to break her apart. The wind outside softened, brushing along the eaves with the gentleness of a memory fading into something kinder. Lydia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of past sorrows ease, replaced by the steady certainty of the life they were building. Day by day, choice by choice, hope no longer felt fragile. It felt shaped by their hands, rooted in their vows, carried in the small footsteps running across the wooden floor. And as night wrapped around the ranch, Lydia whispered a quiet thank you to the darkness itself for leading her here, to this family, to this peace, to this beginning woven softly, tenderly, into the years ahead. End of article. Good night.